Today we're going to learn about the Korean passive verbs, and this class is an introduction class to Korean passive verbs, and we'll learn what kind of formation rules there are and things to note in general about the passive verbs in Korean. And I also have a list of passive verbs that belong to each different group. And here in this class, we will not go over every single passive verb vocabulary today, and that would be for the next 3 live classes. And in those classes, we will focus on memorizing these vocabularies and how to use them in sentences. So it's going to be a session for vocabulary and also sentence making practice. So I hope you guys could join those classes. If not, you can always watch the playback. And you can find the live class schedule at the end of this video or in the description box or in the comment section. And for today, let's focus on understanding how passive verbs are formed and what sort of things to note. You can download all these lists and this, this worksheet that you can take notes on while taking class on my website, the link in the description box. So now let's get started. Okay guys, so let's first start from what exactly is a passive verb, which is 비동사 in Korean. So let me first give you this sentence, guys. Let's say mosquitoes bite people. And this sentence is in active voice because bite is an active verb that the subject of the sentence does, right? Mosquito do the action of biting, and mosquito is the actor. But if you want to change this active voice sentence into a passive voice sentence, most importantly, you should first be changing the verb, the active verb, to its passive counterpart, right? And in English, to change an active verb into a passive verb, you can simply put the be verb, so either is, are, am, was, were, depending on what the subject is, right? And then you put the past participle form of the verb, which is bitten in this case, right? Bites past participle is bitten. And after you switch the verb to a passive verb, since the passive verb indicates that the subject is not the actor of the action, but the receiver of the action, for this sentence to mean the exact same thing as the first sentence, the subject should be switched to people, right? Because people is the one that received biting from mosquitoes, right? So here, the passive verb's subject would be people. And then you change be to are because of subject-verb agreement in English, right? So people are bitten. And to indicate that the biting comes from mosquitoes, you can simply put prepositions like by and then say mosquitoes. So people are bitten by mosquitoes is a passive version of mosquitoes bite people, right? And it works very similarly in Korean active and passive sentences as well. So let me give you the same sentence, the sentence with the same meaning as the English version. So 모기는 사람을 물어요. Now this is how you say mosquitoes bite people in Korean. And 모기 means mosquitoes, 사람 means a person, and 물어요 means bite. And to change 모기는 사람을 물어요 to its passive equivalent, most importantly, you should be changing the verb 물어요 to its passive form, which is 물려요. And then the subject of 물려요 likewise should be 사람, the receiver of the action, because passive verb indicates that the subject is the receiver of the action, not the doer, right? So you can mark 사람 with a subject marker. So I will put 은 here. And then for 모기, mosquitoes, we want to indicate that biting came from 모기. So you could use 에 in this case, particle 에. So here it would mean 사람은 people, 모기에 by mosquitoes. is bitten. So 사람은 모기에 물려요 would be the passive equivalent of the original sentence. 모기는 사람을 물어요. So the basic structure of passive voice sentences in Korean would be you first put the subject, and subject should be the receiver of the action, not the doer of the action, right? So receiver of the action, and then you mark it with a subject marker, either 는 or 이가, and then you put the actor, right? Actor, and put the particle that corresponds to by, which there are plenty, either 에게, 한테, or this is a more formal one, 에 의해, and then you put the passive verb. So here, let me give you a quick particle lesson. 에게 and 한테, you probably know what this particle is. They mean either to a person or from a person, from or by a person. And when it's used with passive verbs, obviously, it's going to mean by or from. And 에게 and 한테 can only be used with a person noun or an animal noun. And as for 에 has plenty of meanings, but here when it means by, it can only be used for non-living things or insects, just like we used 에 for 모기, mosquitoes. And it can also be used for a big group of people, like organizations, companies, or even a country. And 에 의해 is a very formal word that means by, so we're not going to be using 에 의해 in our classes, so you can just remember mainly these three particles, 에, 에게, 한테, that means by. So now that we know the basic structure of the passive sentences, now let's move on to the important part, how to change active verbs into passive verbs. So basically, passive verb formation rules in Korean, right? And there are three main rules to change active verbs into passive verbs in Korean. The first one is adding the suffix, one of the suffixes, either 이, 니, 히, 기, to the active verb stem. And the second one and the third one, I will explain one by one. So let's start from the first rule, adding one of these suffixes, 이디, 히기, to active verb stem. So the question here would be, how do we know which verbs to put 이, 니, 히, and 기? And unfortunately, there is no fixed textbook rule, but thankfully we can find some commonalities among the verbs where 이 is put and among the verbs where 리 is put, among the verbs where he is put, and among the verbs where 기 is put. So let me take out my list of passive verbs. So I'll be putting the same pile up on my website, and I share the link in the description box. So let's briefly go over the verbs. We're not gonna go over every single verb for now. Let's just kind of skim through it and try to figure out the kind of commonalities among these verbs. So as for the active verbs, where you can put 이 to change it into a passive form, usually those verbs stem and then 받침, guys. 받침. Usually a lot of them, and then 받침. So that would be the commonality, stem, and then sorry, I said 받침, it's vowel, not 받침, vowel, right, vowel. And also there are some, you can find some other verbs that end in 히읗 받침. So yeah, let's write it here, and then 히읗 받침. And you can also find a lot of verbs that end in 쌍기역 받침. Actually, guys, let's put it here. So for the active verbs where you can put 이 for passive verb, usually those verbs stem and then vowel or 히읗 받침. And you can also find a lot of 쌍기역 ending verbs as well, like 꺾다, 묵다, and 깎다, 닦다. So that would also be one of the commonalities as well. Usually they are 쌍기역 받침 ending verbs. And one more commonality would be that it's not very common, that there aren't many verbs that end in 피읍 받침, but if it does, usually E is put to make it into a passive verb. So 덥다 becomes 덮이다 for passive verb version. So let's write 피읍 받침 as well here. And let's move on to the next group, 리 group. So for the verbs, where you can put 리 to change it into a passive form, it's quite easy to figure out for this group because mostly they end in 리을 받침, guys. 리을 받침. And even if there are verbs that do not end in 받침, like 듣다, 부르다, 씻다, 자르다, it's quite easily figure outable why they're in this group because 듣다 or 씻다 is an irregular verb that changes to 들어 and 싫어 respectively when conjugated, right? So when they're conjugated, they have 리을 받침 in their form. And also for 부르다 and 자르다, when they're conjugated, it's 불러, 자르다's conjugation, 잘라. So they have 리을 받침 in the word when conjugated. So these types of verbs, for these types of verbs, you can put 리 after a stem. And for irregular verbs, the stem's form also changes. Like 듣다 should be 들리다, not 듣리다, right? So for 리다, guys, 리다, mostly the stem ends in 리을 받침, 리을 받침. And for he and ki group, guys. So you can briefly go over the list and you will find that there are a lot of 기역 받침 and 비읍 받침 ending verbs. And as for ki, the ki group, there are many soft vowel ending verbs like 미음 받침, 시읒 받침, and 치읒 받침 and 니은 받침. So usually 니은, 미음, 시읒, 치읒 받침 ending verbs are in ki group. And here you might be wondering, hey, then what about 티읒, 티귿, and 치읒 받침? None of them are included in this group. And so these are the tricky parts, but for 티읒 ending verbs, guys, there are not many active verbs that end in tiut that you can change into passive verbs, so I'll exclude this one. And as for tiut ending verbs and tiut 받침 ending verbs, it's either one of the two suffix. It's either he or ki, and it depends on the verb. It depends on what verb it is. So for example, guys, 닫다 ends in 디귿 받침, right? 디귿 받침. And 닫다 means to close. And 뜯다, guys, 뜯다 has a lot of meanings, but one of them is to tear something open. And they both end in 디귿 받침. However, they follow a different suffix when when turned into a passive verb. So 닫다, for 닫다 to become a passive verb, you need to add he. 닫히다. So 닫히다 means to be closed. And 뜯다 here, for 뜯다, you have to add ki this time. Not he, like 닫히다, but ki this time for passive verb version. So 뜯기다 would mean to be torn open, to be ripped open, right? So it really depends on which verb it is. And this is something that you would just have to memorize because there is no obvious pattern that you can observe. And as for 치읒 ending verbs, let me give you these two verbs. 찢다, which means to rip, tear, and 잊다, which means to forget. And 찢다, for 찢다 to turn into a passive form, you should be adding ki suffix after it. So 찢기다 would mean to be ripped or torn. And for 잊다, for it to become a passive form, this time you should be putting he. So 잊히다 잊히다 would mean to be forgotten. So for the verbs that end in either tiut or tiut, there is no one consistent rule, unfortunately. Okay, so now let's continue our lesson. And another thing to note about ed, 희귀 suffix are that they cannot be attached to all verbs, meaning they cannot be attached to every single verb there is. So let's look at the verbs where ed, 희귀 cannot be attached. So firstly, intransitive verbs cannot be attached to ed, 희귀. Only transitive verbs can be attached to ed, 희귀. And if the word transitive verb or intransitive verb doesn't sound familiar, let me give you some explanation. So transitive verbs are the verbs that have both the acting end and the receiving end. So grammatical term for acting end would be the subject of a verb, and the receiving end would be the object of a verb. So object is something or someone that the verb is done on to. Subject transfer the effect of the action to the object. That's why it's called transitive verbs. So I brought some of the sentences that have transitive verbs in it. So let's read them all together. So 바람이 wind, 창문을 window, 열었어요 open, right? 열다 past conjugation. So this sentence means the wind opened the window. So basically wind did the action of opening, and the effect of that action opening, window received. So these kinds of verbs, you can say they're transitive verbs. And also 친구가, 친구 is a friend, right? And 매일 is an adverb that means every day. 매일 저를 꼬집어요. Here the object is I, the receiving end is I, and 꼬집다, 꼬집다 means to pinch. So 꼬집어요 means pinch. So this sentence would mean my friend pinch me every day. So this verb also has an acting end and the receiving end, which is me. So friend is transferring the effect of the action pinch to me. So 꼬집다 is also the transitive verb, and 점원 means clerk, someone who works at the store. Clerk, 영수증 is the object here, right? This receiving end. So clerk, receipt, 찢다 means to rip, to tear. So 찢었어요, ripped or tore. So this sentence means the clerk ripped the receipt. So it has an actor and the receiver of the action, the object onto which the verb is done, right? So all these three verbs are considered transitive verbs. And all transitive verbs can be turned into a passive verb. It's just that different formation rule apply depending on the verb. But all the verbs in these example sentences belong to the group of active verbs where they can be changed into a passive form by adding one of the passive suffixes, 이, 히, 리, 기. So with what we learned so far, let's try changing each of the sentence into its passive voice version. So 바람이 창문을 열었어요. For this one, the subject in the passive voice should now be the receiver of the action, which is 창문. So you put 창문 with the subject marker. 창문이 바람 is the actor. So to indicate that, we can put one of the particles we learned that corresponds to by. In this case, it would be 에, because 바람 is a non-living thing. So 창문이 바람에. And now we should be using the passive form of 열다. 열다's passive form is 열리다. 열리다. So you can say 창문이 바람에 열렸어요. 창문이 바람에 열렸어요 would be the passive version of 바람이 창문을 열었어요. And for the second sentence, 친구가 매일 저를 꼬집어요. Here, when you make it into passive voice, the subject should be changed to the receiver of the action, which is 저, right? 저 친구가 매일 저를 꼬집어요. So 저는 친구 is the actor. And to indicate that 친구 is the actor, you can put the particle that means by. In this case, you can use 한테, because 한테 can only be used for person. 저는 친구한테, and then you can add 매일. Doesn't matter if you put 매일 here or here, as long as it's before the verb. There's nothing wrong grammatically. So 저는 매일 친구한테 꼬집어요. 꼬집다's passive form is 꼬집히다. 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 So you can say 저는 매일 친구한테 꼬집혀요. 저는 매일 친구한테 꼬집혀요 would be the passive version of 친구가 매일 저를 꼬집어요. And the last one, 점원이 영수증을 찢었어요. 점원이 영수증을 찢었어요. And here 영수증 would be the subject because it's a receiver of the action this time. And 점원 is, so you mark it with subject marker. And then 점원 is the actor, so you can mark it with a person marker. 한테, that means by or from. 영수증이 점원한테 찢었어요. 찢다 means to rip, and the passive form of 찢다 is 찢기다. So you can say 영수증이 점원한테 찢겼어요. And as you have realized by now, it follows the same conjugation rule. The passive form follows the same conjugation rule. So you can apply the conjugation rule that you know. So all these passive form ends in E vowel. You can conjugate them following E vowel ending conjugation rules, right? So that's why 열리다 becomes 열렸어요. 꼬집히다 becomes 꼬집혀요 in present tense. 찢기다 becomes 찢겼어요 in past tense, right? And so only transitive verbs can be attached to ed, he, ki to change into a passive form. And as for intransitive verbs, guys, they in and of itself cannot be changed into a passive form because let me give you the example verbs that belong to intransitive verbs. So first one is 일어나다, and 일어나다 has two meanings. It means to wake up, for someone to wake up, and also for something to happen. And when you wake up, you just wake up, right? The subject wakes up. Of course, in English, wake up can also be used as a transitive verb because you can always wake someone up. But in Korean, 일어나다 only has the meaning of for someone to wake up, to do the action of wake up, not waking somebody else. So that sort of verbs we call intransitive. The subject does that action, but it has no other object to transfer the effect of the action to. It's just that the subject does. It's an independent action that the subject does. And also for happen as well. Happen. You don't happen something. Something just happens, right? So these kind of verbs are called intransitive. And other examples would be 자다, which means to sleep. And it's obvious why sleep is intransitive verb. You cannot sleep someone, right? You just sleep. Someone just sleeps. And also 울다. Verbs like 웃다, to cry. You don't cry someone, you cry, right? Also 웃다, to smile, to laugh. These verbs are the examples of intransitive verbs. And intransitive verbs in and of itself cannot be changed into a passive form because these verbs don't have object. And in the passive sentence, the receiver of the action should be the subject, right? But when you try to make these verbs into passive verb, what are you going to put the subject? none, right? There's none. And you don't want to make a sentence where subject is non-existent, right? There's no point. So I'm sure you understand why intransitive verbs cannot be attached to passive suffixes. But not all transitive verbs can be attached to 이, 히, 리, 기. And there are other types of verbs that are transitive verbs that cannot be attached to 이, 히, 리, 기 either. And those are 하다 ending verbs. Like you guys know there are many noun plus 하다 format of verbs, right? Like 취소하다, to cancel. It literally is the combination of noun plus 하다, cancellation plus do. So literally it means do cancellation, but 취소하다, this verb, becomes one word to mean to cancel. And 수정하다 means to revise. 하다 ending verbs cannot be turned into a passive verb by using 이, 히, 리, 기. There are other ways, which we'll learn in the next section. And also, some of the exceptions among transitive verbs where 이, 히, 리, 기 cannot be attached to are 만들다, 버리다, 켜다, 끄다, 깨다, blah, 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 and so on. So now the question would be, how do we turn these groups, these types of verb, into a passive form? So that's where these other two rule, the next two rule kicks in. So for this group, guys, this group C, the exceptions, transitive verbs exceptions, is random exceptions, random group of exceptions. For these groups, you can apply this rule, verb-아, 지다. And this, please don't confuse it with adjective 지다, guys. Adjective 지다. If you remember what it means, what this grammar means, then that's awesome. But these two are different things. Adjective 지다 means to turn, to become adjective. And when it's 지다 is combined with verb, it has a function of making a verb into a passive form. So these two are clearly different things. So if we bring some of the exception verbs like 만들다, 켜다, 깨다, 끄다. So for these exception verbs, they can be made into a passive form by combining it with 치다 format. So it would be 만들어지다 and 켜지다 and 꺼지다 and 깨지다, right? So that's pretty easy. You can just conjugate the verb in present tense and then put 지다 to make it into a passive form. But what would be the difficult part about this part would be memorizing the exception verbs that don't belong to 이, 히, 리, 기 suffix group. So that's why I recommended that you guys don't try to remember like rules and try to apply it to every single passive verb, because there are many exceptions, and even in those exceptions there's no like logic behind it, right? So this is something that you should be memorizing. But don't worry guys, I have a list of common passive verbs where 치다 is combined, and also we're going to go over some of the passive verbs where both 이, 히, 리, 기 suffix and 치다 form are commonly used. So we're going to go over these words in our live classes. I'll make sure I do my best to help you remember these words in a way that sticks and enhance your memory. And actually, guys, there's another thing I want to mention about 치다, this form, and this is not super important, so you can forget about it after hearing it, and I'm not going to cover this in my passive verb classes, but it's also an interesting usage. So, 치다 can actually be attached to 90% of the verbs. So 90% of the verbs can be attached to 치다. Whether that verb is transitive or intransitive doesn't matter. It can be combined with 치다 to mean it naturally happens. Verb naturally happens. So for example, guys, 일어나다 means for something to happen or for someone to wake up. This is an intransitive verb. And 일어나다 can be attached to 치다 to mean 일어나다 naturally happens. Waking up naturally happens. So for example, 저는 아침에 안 일어나져요. What do you guys think this sentence means? So 저는 아침에 in the morning 안 일어나져요. Since 일어나지다 means for waking up to naturally happen. This person is saying naturally waking up early in the morning doesn't happen. So basically, it's hard for me, 저, to wake up early in the morning. That's what this person is trying to say. And also, guys, 가다 means to go. 가다, this kind of verb can also be attached to 치다 and become 가치다. And this 가치다 would mean for going to naturally happen, right? So you could say something like 엑셀이 고장나서 차가 안 가져요. Excel means accelerator and 고장나다 means something to not function well. So 엑셀이 고장나서 my Excel is not working. So 차가 안 가져요 would mean my car won't move naturally. My car moving naturally doesn't happen because my accelerator is broken. My accelerator is not working. So in these contexts, you can easily tell that 가져요, verbs like 가져요 or 일어나져요 are not passive verbs. They just mean verb naturally happening. So since this doesn't really fall into passive verb category, I'm going to exclude this usage of 치다 in my next passive verb live classes and maybe talk about it in my other classes. And back to what I said about 90% of the verbs can be attached to 아어지다 to mean verb naturally happens. You might be curious what are the rest 10% of the verbs that cannot be attached to 아어지다 to mean verb naturally happens. And those verbs are either 하다 ending verbs or 지다 ending verbs. So I'll explain what I mean by 지다 ending verbs soon. But for 하다 ending verbs, guys, they're normally not attached to 아어지다, and if they do, it'll sound very awkward. Instead, there are other ways to make 하다 ending verbs to mean something naturally happens or something happens well, which is changing 하다 to 되다 or 잘 되다. 되다 is also a passive form of 하다 ending verb, which I'll explain in the next rule that applies to 하다 ending verbs for turning it into passive form. And now let me explain what I mean by 지다 ending verbs. So 지다 ending verbs already end in 치다. So when you try to combine it with 치다, it will sound very, very weird. That's why 치다 ending verbs cannot be combined with 치다. And the examples of 치다 ending verbs, guys, I brought them here. So 떨어지다, 터지다, 넘어지다, 쓰러지다, 사라지다. And one interesting thing about these verbs is that they do not come from another active verb. They are just independent verb on their own. They in and of itself look like this. So for example, 떨어지다 kind of look like it's from the verb 떨다, but it's not. And same with the rest, guys. So here I said intransitive verbs that already have passive meaning, but I'm not sure what I mean by that myself, so I'm just gonna exclude this and change the title, intransitive verbs that end in 치다. And even though they're not passive verbs per se, I included this vocabs in my passive verb vocabs list just so that you don't get them mixed up with being a passive verb. So yeah, we're going to learn these words as well in our next 3 live classes. And now, finally, let's learn how to change 하다 ending verbs into its passive form. So that's where rule number 3 kicks in. So 하다 ending verbs, guys, can be turned into a passive form by changing 하다 into either 되다 or 받다 or 당하다. And this is actually a pretty logical rule. 되다 is used when the subject of the passive verb is a non-living thing. And 받다 is used when the subject of a passive verb is a person. And 당하다 is also used when the subject of a passive verb is a person, but also when it's something negative, when the verb is something negative. So let me give you guys example sentence. If you want to say, the reservation is canceled. So this is obviously a passive voice sentence, and the subject is a reservation. A reservation is a non-living thing. It's not a person, right? A person or animal. So you can put 되다 for its passive form. So cancel is 취소하다 in Korean. So now you can write 취소되다 and say 취소됐어요. 예약이 취소됐어요. The reason why 취소되다 here is conjugated in past tense 취소됐어요 and not the present tense like the English sentence is because for Korean passive verbs, when you're talking about the already finished, the already done result, rather than what usually happens or what is the case now, they're usually conjugated in past tense. And we'll learn more about this when we actually practice making sentences with many passive verb vocabularies in our next live classes. And what if you want to say, I was invited to the party. In this sentence, the subject is I. The person that's invited is I. So invite. To invite is 초대하다. Then what would you change 하다 to make it into a passive form? 되다, 받다, or 당하다. It makes most sense to use 받다 because 당하다 is for negative, something negative, and invitation is not a negative thing at all. So you can say 파티에 to the party, 파티에 초대받았어요. 파티에 초대받았어요. And what if you want to say something negative, like I was rejected? So reject is 거절하다. How would you change 하다 to make it into a passive verb? It would be 당하다, because you were done something negative. So for I was rejected, you can say 저는 거절당했어요. So that's how you can turn 하다 ending verbs into its passive form. And this is my favorite part actually because it's very simple. There's no exceptions. And if you just chance upon 하다 ending verbs, then you know that you can either change it to 되다 or 받다 or 당하다 for its passive form. And you can just pay attention to its subject. If it's non-living thing, you use 되다. If it's a person, you use either 받다 or 당하다. And if it's something negative, you use 당하다. And if it's something positive or relatively neutral, then you can use 받다. And before I end this class, guys, I also want to briefly mention such a thing called 사동사, guys. 사동사, which is the causative verb. And causative verbs are the verbs that have a meaning of to make somebody do something. So for example, 울다 means to cry, but its causative form, 울리다, would mean to make someone cry. And 먹다 means to eat. And 먹이다, its causative form, would mean to make somebody eat. So to feed someone. And the reason why I wanted to bring it up is because 사동사 are also formed in a very similar way with 비동사. Of course, they have different rules, different rules are applied, but it's similar in that you can make a verb into a causative by adding one of these suffixes, 이, 리, 이히, 리기, or 우, and 추 after a stem, or by adding other verbs like 시키다 and 부러뜨리다, blah, 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 which we'll learn in a separate causative session. I just wanted to bring this up so that you guys can confuse when you chance upon a word that looks like a passive verb but doesn't have a passive meaning. Those verbs are likely causative verbs. And you don't need to feel scared, guys. Just like passive verbs, you don't need to focus too much on the formation rules of causative verbs either. And it's better to focus more on memorizing what each verb means and how it's used. All right? Okay, so now it's time for announcing the live schedule. Okay, so for the second passive verb class, which is the class right next to this one, this live class will be on May 8th, Monday at 11 a.m. KST. So I hope you guys, many of you guys could join this live stream class. And also for the other two classes, which will be on May 17th and May 26th, respectively, I have not finalized the time yet, but if I do, I will make sure to announce it on my channel's community post or maybe on my website. I'll keep you guys updated on this. First thing first, I hope to see many of you guys in my next live class. If you cannot join, you can always check the playback, so please don't worry. Oh, I forgot to mention, you can always prepare for the live class by checking out the vocabulary file that I uploaded on my website so that it gives you a little more of a confidence boost when joining the class and participating. Okay, so I'll end the class here and I'll see you in the next live class, which is on May 8th. Bye-bye, guys.